So we'll have it for posterity. And let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get started with this very interesting book of Ecclesiastes. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for being able to look into your word. Thank you for providing your word to us, that we can have guidance in this life, and we don't have a dark and narrow path to go down, Lord, that we don't know where we're going, but you provided to us wisdom. And Lord, just help us with the interpretation tonight of this book of Ecclesiastes. And Lord, I'm a bit confused myself by it right now. So I pray that you would help all of us to just gain a little bit of insight and understanding into your word, and especially this book tonight, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. This is lesson 5 of part 2 of the Grow class. So we've been working through the poetry part of the Bible of the Old Testament. And we've looked at the Psalms, and we've looked at Proverbs. And so now we're moving into Ecclesiastes, and we'll finish up with Song of Solomon next week. And then after that, we'll go into the prophets and start looking at the prophets of the Old Testament. And just remember that these poetry books kind of fill into the original history that we learned with that word starting. And almost all of these writings are in that glory period of Israel. So the time of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. And so a lot of the Psalms, of course, are written by David. And we looked at Proverbs, who was written by Solomon. King Solomon mostly did the writing of Proverbs. And he also wrote this book that we're looking at tonight called Ecclesiastes. So in the start there on page 34 of your outline, it says both of the next 2 books that we'll study were written by Solomon. One was written in his old age, and the other was written when he was a very young man. So you'll probably be able to tell that this is the book he wrote when he was old, and Song of Solomon is more of a romantic book when he wrote when he was young. These books teach us that very wise men fail in their pursuit of righteousness. In this lesson, we will learn what happened to Solomon in his life, study his wisdom, and hopefully learn from his mistakes. So anyone like to share on your reflections from reading this book of Ecclesiastes?
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
As I read through the book, I, like you, found myself going around in circles. But I also try to keep it in a framework of what's happening in the world today, what's happening to our politics, what's happening to our nation, what's happening to the world. And it kind of boils down to this, that Ecclesiastes is as applicable today as it was the day it was written. And that's kind of what my bottom line is.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight because as you read through it, Solomon is attempting all of the same things that people try today to fulfill their life. Very much people try to force this something into that God-shaped emptiness that's in their heart, and they try all these things that Solomon tried. So I think that's definitely true, that it's just as true today as it was when he wrote it. So that's a good insight. Anybody else? All right.
I thought it was a little sad. Solomon had everything, and then to come to the conclusion at the end of his life that maybe he wasted a huge portion of his life.
Yeah, it is sad to think that Solomon could have ended his life, that he was probably the most glorious king that ruled Israel. The kingdom was the greatest when he was the king. And to think that he would have ended his life with these thoughts is sad. And one of the things that Pastor Miller talked about as he teaches through this is that if you look in Hebrews chapter 11, it's like the Hall of Fame of faith. So where it lists like about 45 different Bible characters and how they walked with God in their faith. And there's all these characters of the Old Testament listed, but Solomon is not listed in Hebrews chapter 11. So he's left out, even though he was probably the king over the Israel during the height of Israel's power.
Well, it may be sad that Solomon came to this conclusions, but he was still looking at it, I think, from a broader perspective. And what I took away is what his final look at it was, is that everything is in God's hands. No matter, this is why everything that man tries to do is fruitless. I mean, it's not going to produce anything because we can't change anything that God has put in place. Now, today we strive and strive and strive to understand the stuff that he's put in place, but we can't change any of it. The second thing is that he's saying to enjoy life as God has given it to us. And I think that's the other thing we need to take away, that when it's all said and done, stop worrying about everything. God's in charge. Just sit back and chill.
Okay. I like that.
With God.
Yeah. To enjoy the simple things of life. You know, he does at a few places just say, you know, eat, drink, and enjoy your work and enjoy your family. So he kind of boils it down to those simple things, although it's interesting. Solomon talks about enjoying his family, but he had kind of a pretty large family with 700 wives and 300 concubines. So that may have impacted his outlook on life. Also, there's something that we'll look at as we're reading through this, is that some scholars believe that Solomon did not write all of this book, that he wrote to a certain point, and then some editor came in at the end to say, okay, yeah, all that is true, what you just heard, so fear God and follow the commandments. That's kind of the bottom line lesson, fear God and follow the commandments. And that may not have been what Solomon wrote. It was someone maybe coming along later. At least that's what Pastor Miller talks about. So,
you're talking about family. I kind of thought it was interesting, and there's a passage in here that it didn't say specifically, but it alluded to the fact that the author may have had 1,000 children.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't catch that part, but that's definitely possible with that many wives. So anyway, that's a lot of child support you have to pay. So, about that. Okay, I am going to open up the PowerPoint. Okay, it says I can't minimize, so I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to try to find the PowerPoint here. Here it is. And that is this. So can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. The other, I guess, before we actually get started with the outline, the one thing that I thought of, which was brought up, was there's two ways to really interpret this book of Ecclesiastes. There's one way you can look at it, which we've kind of been talking about, is that Solomon came to the end of his life and he had kind of lost his faith, and this was in some ways him kind of relating that his thoughts towards the end of his life. The other way to look at it is that Solomon was writing as if he was an unbeliever, kind of what they call being the devil's advocate. So taking the other side of the argument to finally come to that one conclusion that really all that you need to worry about in life is to fear God and to follow his commandments. So maybe he was taking the devil's advocate, and I had to look that up because, I've heard that term, and my wife sometimes tells me that I love to be the devil's advocate. Like, I know what she thinks, so I'll take the other side just for fun. and to debate that, which not always a good plan in a marriage to do that. But actually that term comes from the Catholic Church, devil's advocate, which I was surprised to find out that when they were considering giving sainthood to a particular person or an apostle or whatever, they would find someone who would argue the other side to say that this person should not be sainted, that maybe the miracle that happened was not really a miracle, or maybe they weren't as moral as what everybody thinks.
Right.
So the devil's advocate was taking the other side of whether this person should be a saint or not. And in fact, as I looked it up, when they were considering Mother Teresa to be a saint, and she was sainted by the Catholic Church, so she's now Saint Teresa. But they chose a very famous atheist named Christopher Hitchens, who's an English atheist, to be the devil's advocate in considering whether Mother Teresa should be a saint or not. And so, of course, he lost the argument, and she was sainted. But that is the kind of the beginnings or the history of this term, devil's advocate. So it's possible that this book was written kind of as, okay, here is the way an unbeliever or someone who's not walking with God looks at life. And so to give you that perspective. So I think Pastor Miller kind of doesn't really agree with that, but I think it's an interesting way to look at this particular book. So think of it from both ways as we're talking about it. So let's get into the notes. Any last thoughts there before we go on into the notes?
Yeah, David, I found my reference. It's under 6:3, and I stand corrected. It's not 1,000 children, it's 100.
Okay, well.
And when it says a man may have 100 children and live many years and yet not matter how long he lives if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial. I say that a stillborn child is still better off than he.
Okay.
And for him to make the conclusion, he would have to know what it's like to have 100 children.
Yeah. So so apparently the more children you have, the more joy you are supposed to have, I guess, what he's saying. So Trevor, our worship leader, should be the happiest person in our church. He has 6 kids. So, all right. But yeah, he may have, with the 700 wives, 100 children would have been kind of a no-brainer, at least 100 kids, you would think. All right. So while Proverbs is wisdom explained, Ecclesiastes is wisdom experienced. So it is a book of struggle. And the key word in the whole book is this word meaningless, which some of you have already brought up. Meaningless, that life is meaningless. There is no meaning. There is no purpose. And, if you have that feeling, it might be a struggle to get out of bed in the morning, and thinking of it from the devil's advocate standpoint, that is the way a lot of lost people feel, that life is meaningless. They can't figure out the purpose, why they're even here, why should I even get up in the morning. So it's a book of struggle, and it is a story of Solomon trying to find purpose apart from God. So He, in other words, is kind of going through the experience for us of trying to find something in the earth or in life apart from God that will bring satisfaction. So he's kind of decided he's going to do this for us so that we don't have to do it for ourselves, and see what kind of conclusion. Maybe he will find something that brings him meaning and joy apart from God. So that was, I think, the person who wrote this book, Solomon, what he was trying to see if there was something apart from God that would bring meaning. So as you read it, you realize there are repeating phrases, and this is because it's poetry. He is repeating things kind of over and over again. There is some prose in here, but most of it's poetry. He says 34 times in, what do we have, 12 chapters? 11? 12 chapters, life is meaningless, 34 times. And he starts the book off, chapter 1, verse 2, life is meaningless, says the teacher. And then in verse 11:8, which is where we think Solomon's writing stopped, the last part, it says, meaningless, says the teacher, everything is meaningless. So he starts the book, ends the book with the same words. And that's Hebrew poetry. If you remember back, there's a form of it, and they like to repeat things over and over again in kind of a way. So they don't really rhyme words. That's not how people can tell it's poetry. And in the Hebrew way, it's like starting and ending with the same thing. That is one of the ways, the tools of poetry. So Ecclesiastes 1:2, like I said, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. So kind of a form of this, there is nothing new under the sun. It is used 29 times in Ecclesiastes. So even back in 930 BC, when this was written, Solomon is saying there's nothing new. Everything's been thought. Everything has already been tried. There is nothing new under the sun. There's really not anything new that's being created. God created everything in the beginning, and it's all here. So Ecclesiastes 1:9 said, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And the last one is used 7 times, this term, chasing after the wind. So trying to catch the wind is kind of fruitless. It's like trying to get to the end of the rainbow. That rainbow just keeps moving. And you never can catch it. So it might be a fun game for a while. I wonder how old my grandson needs to be before I tell him, hey, go try to catch the wind out there in the field. All right. Chasing after the wind 7 times. So Ecclesiastes 1:14 says, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Okay, so basic facts about Ecclesiastes is that the author is Solomon, and it's not really, the name's not mentioned, but he's called this term teacher. The writer is called by the term teacher, which is explained that the Hebrew word for that means kind of the leader of the country, or the one who's in charge. So at the time, it was Solomon. So some of the ways we know that, Ecclesiastes 1:1 says the words of the teacher, the son of David, the king of Jerusalem. So of course, Solomon was the son of King David. Wasn't his only son, but the one, anybody remember who was the mother of Solomon?
Bathsheba.
Right, Bathsheba. So it was a second or third marriage for David. And so, and then even Solomon wasn't the oldest, even from Bathsheba, or maybe the oldest surviving son of Bathsheba. Ecclesiastes 1:12, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. Ecclesiastes 1:16, I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much wisdom and knowledge. So going back to Proverbs, we knew that Solomon was the writer of most of Proverbs. So this is talking about the wisdom. So just some of the ways that we know that Solomon was the writer, the author of this book. Recipients were all of Israel, but particularly this was to go to Solomon's son, although this, to me, would not be, it would not be the message that you would want to give your son. Maybe the very final message of fear God and follow his commandments. But how many of you have told your kids everything you did when you were young? Or did you hide some things from them? So Solomon here is pretty much laying it all out for his son, saying, I have tried everything. Some of you grew up in the 60s, so you should be telling me you haven't told your kids everything. All right, so written about 930 BC. So I kind of was interested in how old was Solomon when he wrote this book. Solomon died when he was right around 60 years old. So he did not live to be a real old person. So it's likely that he wrote this very close to the time that he passed away. And if you remember, he didn't train his son that well. That would be Rehoboam. And we remember Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam split the kingdom, and from that point, there was north and the south, and it was all downhill after Solomon. So from all that wisdom, didn't really get to the next generation. So the purpose is to show a man who tries it all and finds no meaning in life apart from God. And the way I look at it, I guess I've thought in my life numerous times. It's been a while since I've thought this way, but you know, if I could just win the lottery and I had millions of dollars, man, life would be so much better and so much more fun and so much easier. And so Solomon's already went down that road and realized it's not the road to go down. And there's all sorts of books and stories about people who have won the lottery and had all this money given to them, and they don't, I don't think very many of them end up happy. So, you know, we think riches, pleasure, you know, going on a vacation will make me happy, and it's Solomon's already tried it, and it didn't work. So there's got to be another answer, I think, is what he's trying to tell us. So, two views on page 35 of Ecclesiastes, and I've kind of already touched on this. Solomon is simply playing devil's advocate, which is kind of I thought an interesting concept. I'd never taken this book that way before. Or the second is that this is the story of Solomon's life. That he really did get to the end of his life, and he really did think that things were meaningless, and that he tried all these things and did not find any joy. And we can read from, if you want to write down this particular reference, 1 Kings chapter 11. And I'll read verses 1 through 6. why probably number 2 is the correct answer here. It says, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. So that was kind of the final epitaph of Solomon's life, is that he got to the end of his life, and all of the foreign wives who followed different religions and different gods turned his heart away from the Lord God. And if you go down further in that chapter, it says that the Lord himself appeared to Solomon twice in his life. So, I mean, that's an actual physical appearance that Solomon experienced in his life, and still at the end of his life walked away from God. So I don't know if there's anybody here that can say God has.
My stuff.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Joy.
I'm sorry, no, I wasn't.
Okay.
Nothing.
Okay. So, I think from the Gospels, when Thomas saw Jesus resurrected, and he said, blessed are those who don't see and yet believe. So Solomon saw God twice, and God revealed himself to him twice, and he still walked away from him. So I kind of think my view is that it's probably number 2. It wasn't just Solomon playing the game of the other side. It really was the story of his life, which is really sad when you really get down to think about that for Solomon. So outline of Ecclesiastes, if you read through it, the first 11 verses are the introduction, which is an overview of what he's going to talk about. So I'll read this. It says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All the streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been done will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. There is no remembrance of men of old. Even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Wow. Okay. So a real positive guy there.
Yeah.
Looking at life and just saying, I've lived my life. I'm getting old here. And man, I'm not finding any purpose here in life. And think about the background of Solomon turning away from God at the end. So
Hey, Jay.
now, go ahead.
Just falling back just a second here. You were talking about all his concubines and all his women and stuff. And let's see, it's verse 728. He says, while I was still searching but not finding, I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. So it kind of looks like he's kind of a sexist, and he understands that the women that he's been associated with have led him astray.
Right. He kind of sees it at the end here, that he's allowed that in his life. He does say later, and we'll get to that he should have stayed with the wife of his youth. He should have stuck with that one wife. He should have been a one-woman man, but realized in the end that, he couldn't go backwards.
Yeah, he was never any happier.
Pardon?
He was never any happier.
No. And we remember from the history that some of those marriages were political. They weren't, I'm tired of this wife now, so I'm going to go find me a new wife. It was, a political reason why he was getting wives from all these different countries. He was we're giving daughters in marriage to some of these other countries and making these treaties with other countries by trading wives and that sort of thing. But still, in the end, it did not do him any good. So that's the introduction. He starts off. So, usually you try to get people's attention by wanting them to keep reading, but you'd think after the first 11 verses, you're so depressed that you wouldn't want to keep reading. But the assignment was to read the whole book. So hopefully you kept going after those first 11 chapters. So the second part, chapters 1 and 2, Solomon said, I've tried it all. So what did he try? What all did he try? So we'll read a little bit of this. And remember, he was the richest man in the world, so there was nothing that he couldn't try. It says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. Stop there. I mean, I've heard people say, especially younger people, when we finally save up enough money and we can buy our own house and live in our own house, we're going to be happy. Have you ever heard anybody say that before? 5, I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers. He bought the entertainers and had a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So it's kind of, he's been able to take this pursuit to places where most people can't go because they don't have the resources, and just had the greatest palace. And I thought that was interesting. He said, I acquired men and women singers. So it's like, all right, I bought the Beatles and I had them live at my house, is kind of what he's saying. Or, the greatest singers, greatest actors, actresses of the day, they were all there for just my entertainment, not, for everybody else. And so he had all of this entertainment, pleasure, money, buildings, everything. And he says, in the end, it was all meaningless. So kind of the way our world looks at things. You see the advertising on TV and all these people being so happy with, this particular product will make them happy. Or if you drink this particular kind of soda, then, you'll be young and you'll be at the beach and you'll have all these friends and run around and it's just, again, chasing after the wind, to try to find pleasure in these things. That's what he's saying. So he says, I tried it all. Ecclesiastes 3 verses, and then through chapter 8, he says, I've seen it all. And some of you remember this song, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to scatter stones, a time to gather them, a time to embrace, a time to refrain. And I guess that's the end of that. So, and it goes on and on. It's a, this was the Byrds' hit song from the late 60s. If we kept reading it, it would say a time for war and a time for peace. And he says that the Byrds repeated that a number of times in that song because it was in the middle of Vietnam. So, but really what he's saying here is that I've seen all these things. I've been everywhere. I've had all of the experience in life that anybody can have, and still I'm getting to the end of my life. And without God, it's meaningless. So I've seen it all. And finally, chapters 8 through 12, I've considered it all. So he went through all of these experiences. He saw all these things. He built all these things. He experienced all these pleasures, wives, entertainment. And then he sat down to consider it. And he says in chapter 8, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe man's labor on earth, his eyes not seeing sleep day or night, then I saw all God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all his efforts to search it out, man cannot discover its meaning. Even if a wise man claims he knows it, he cannot really comprehend it. So he kind of closes the book here by saying that I've considered it all. And I still, at the very end, Solomon says it's meaningless. But then we have this little part at the end in chapter 12, which Pastor Miller believes was added later after Solomon. That Solomon finished the book with chapter 12, verse 8, which says meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, everything is meaningless. And then the editor added at the end saying in verse 13, now all has been heard, for here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. 12 and 9 says, not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. And this is just a reading of this in chapter 12, which gets to the end and says, there's only two things that matter, fear God and obey him. Which is kind of, if you go back and start where Solomon started out in the book of Proverbs, does anybody remember what was the beginning of wisdom and knowledge?
Fear of God.
The fear of God, right, was the beginning of both wisdom and knowledge. So he gets to the very end and repeats this and says, really, that's it. He simplifies life down to this, saying, if I make this the foundation of my life, then I will find meaning, fearing God and obeying him.
Mhm.
So sounds like Pastor Rick's message from Sunday. Obey the commandments.
Yeah.
So the punchline, I guess, is always the same. And I won't read through all this, but it gets down to that, fear God and keep his commandments. So
Yeah.
we'll get down to, the last page of our notes. Try to finish up on time tonight. So some unique passages in Ecclesiastes. And Pastor Miller said that, like, as he was teaching through this, is that there are sayings that people use all the time, and they don't really understand or realize that it comes from this particular book. Like that part, a time for everything. We just went through that. A lot of times read maybe at a funeral or something like that. Time to be born, a time to die. I just got done reading that, Ecclesiastes 3, so I won't read it again. The second one is eternity in the hearts of men. Ecclesiastes 3:11, saying that God put eternity in the hearts of men. My youngest son, not following God right now. I mean, he was baptized as a Christian when he was a teenager. Not really following God right now. We just had another discussion last week when we were having dinner together, and I was bringing up this particular part of Ecclesiastes, that eternity is in the heart of every man, and so there's that, like it's put a God-shaped hole in every person, that until God comes and live with them, they feel this meaninglessness, this lack of purpose, and they try to fill it with all of these various many things. The other point from this is that every culture that you can find that has existed from the beginning until now believes, at least in the beginning, that culture believes in an afterlife. You know, certain types of political systems try to get rid of that, tamp that down, and end that belief. But every culture starts out with some sort of a belief in an afterlife. And that comes from the fact is that that's how we're created. We're created to believe in eternity. We can't really accept the fact, which our world tries to teach us, that death is really the end. And that's it. And we're just animals like all the other animals on the earth. And we live a certain time and then we die, and then that's the end. So this is saying in Ecclesiastes that every person deep down understands and knows that eternity is real. So I'll keep working on my son with that. So Ecclesiastes 3:9, what does the worker gain from his toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on men. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. It's very similar to what Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, where he talks about, you know, you can know that God exists just by looking at the creation. By looking at something, you accept or you know that there was a creator behind it. The philosophers use the watch. You look at a watch on a table and you don't believe that all of those pieces of the watch came together, without any kind of creator or watchmaker who took those pieces and put them together. So we just naturally assume when we see something like that, that there was someone who put it together. We all know that. We all know that there's eternity. But people, I've heard it said before that a man's morality dictates his theology. So if I don't want to live according to God's commands, then I will find some other way to explain God away so that I can live without following God's commands. A dead lion, Ecclesiastes 9:4. And it says, anyone who is among the living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. And Pastor Miller says in his teaching that Solomon is essentially referring to himself because he's gotten to the end of his life. And even though he's the king, he would rather be a servant and be young than be the king and be old. Like we say, you've heard it put before, that youth is wasted on the young. That's kind of what he's saying is, the young people don't realize that they're young until you get old and you realize, whoa, it was nice to be young when I was young, but I'm no longer young anymore. So I think we hear that from the pulpit every once in a while from Pastor Rick too. So what he's saying is I'd rather be a young man without anything than be an old man and a king. So the other unique passage, he does talk about the wife of your youth, Ecclesiastes 9:9. So the king with 700 wives says, enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. So he doesn't say enjoy life with your wives. He says enjoy life with your wife. So he is advocating here for sticking with your marriage. And don't go down the way he tried with all the wives. All right. So yeah, Solomon, he should talk about sticking with the wife of his youth, right? All right, an answer for everything. Ecclesiastes 10:19 says, a feast is made for laughter and wine makes life merry, but money is the answer for everything. So again, the worldly viewpoint that money is the answer for everything. So it's a bad example for us, right? To think that money is the answer for everything, but that's how the world looks at it. And this is
As
what
many times as he mentions his,
Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, as many times as he mentions wine, you would think that's the panacea for all happiness.
Okay, yeah. He does mention that a lot too. Feasting, wine, eat, drink, and be merry. I think that comes from this book, along with some other places in Scripture. It's kind of what he's advocating. All right, and lastly, well, the answer for all life is found here. This is not meant for us to use as wisdom, but to understand how far Solomon has fallen when he thinks money is the answer for everything. And it's what we try to teach, like when we teach in the Dave Ramsey plan on using God's principles for money. It's interesting that once you get to following God's principles on money, and you kind of take money out of the equation of happiness, things can happen to you and you can lose money, and you don't get as upset as you would if you're not looking at it from God's perspective. So as you go along reading the other parts of the Bible about money and live by it, you begin to realize that money is not the answer for everything. All right, and the last kind of unique passage is the study of old age, which this is depressing to talk about. So he says in 12, he says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. It says in verse 2, well, I'll just go through this because he kind of walks through that. So Solomon in verse 1 says he finds no pleasure, not just joy in life, but probably some type of intimate or sexual pleasure. So they believe that he's referring to here that he's finding no pleasure in the old age. So maybe he's lost abilities that he's had when he was younger, before some of the drugs that are available now.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, David.
So 700
like
wives and 300 concubines, but so that's what Pastor Miller, I'm going to put the blame on him. That's what he says he's referring to here in verse 1. He finds no pleasure. Of course, verse 2, he goes in, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark and the clouds return. Well, let me go back. And the clouds return after the rain. So he's saying the moon and the stars grow dark here. And so Solomon's eyesight is going, one of the things of old age. I was thinking I'm 55, almost 56, and I have different glasses for everything. I have glasses for the computer. I have glasses for reading. I have glasses for driving. And Neil, you'll like this. I have glasses for golfing.
Yes.
So
Are they working?
yeah. So for some, I didn't need that when I was 18 years old.
Uh-uh.
You know,
No.
I needed glasses, but I only needed one set of glasses for everything. So old age, you start to lose the sight, the eyesight starts to go. And think about, the Solomon, they didn't have the ways to adjust for these issues in his day. So he's having to live with these old age issues. And maybe it's just another way that our world keeps us from actually following after God by trying to find all of these different ways to keep us young, artificially keep us young, so that we don't ever consider the fact that one of these days we are going to die. So I better figure out what's going to happen when I die. So we have all these artificial ways to stay young. So verse 3, it says, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows grow dim. So he's talking about the keepers of the house tremble. We think that Solomon's bones are beginning to hurt, that hold his body together, that he's having lots of aches and pains everywhere as he gets older. And the grinders ceasing, he's missing teeth too, is what he's talking about here. The grinders cease because they are few. So, that great steak that they're trying to feed him, he can't enjoy it anymore because he doesn't have any teeth left. So, without the dentists that we have today and the false teeth and all that stuff that we can get, he had to live with that. Those looking through the window grow dim. Is referring to his eyesight again. He can't see anything. Verse 4 says, when the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades, and when men rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. So he's talking about he's losing his hearing too as he gets older. So, I'm losing my hearing. I have hearing aids. I tell that to people that my ears are being used for way too many things right now. To hold my glasses on my head, to hold up my hearing aids, and this mask that I got to wear when I go places. I can't handle anything else on my ears. So, all right. In verse 5, talks about when men are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags himself along and desire no longer is stirred, the man goes to his eternal home and mourners go about the streets. So he's talking about that, when you get older, you get afraid of heights and you get afraid of, just walking down the street maybe at times or walking. We just had a lady that I know, and you may have gotten the email that she needed a walker, because of some of the health issues that she's going through right now. So just part of old age, when you get to be some of our ages, you shouldn't get up on a ladder. So I had a guy in the church who has spent his life up on ladders, and his wife was right there telling me that he doesn't go up on ladders anymore, but he was behind her kind of winking at me like she thinks I don't go up on ladders anymore, but I do. So you might be able to think of somebody who's been up on a lot of ladders in their life that we go to church with. So, and then when the almond tree blossoms is a reference to when the hair turns white or gray, a person gets older. So, and then grasshopper drags himself along is a phrase that's very difficult to understand and interpret, but is probably referring to the way that a man must walk as he begins to lose some of the strength in his legs. So it's the grasshopper dragging himself along, not jumping and leaping like he used to. So talk about ending the book depressing. So last phrase, the desire no longer is stirred. Poor Solomon. He got old. So he's afraid of old age and death, and he should be, because he's walked away from God. All right, any thoughts on that before I finish up? Well, we'll talk about, there's some familiar saying, the good old days in 7:10. Ecclesiastes 7:10 says, do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. So a lot of people like to say, I wish we were back in those good old days, back when the Republicans and the Democrats didn't fight like they do now, because things were so much better and people got along so much better back in the good old days, right? I don't know. I think they were fighting back then too, but so he's saying, don't say, oh, I wish we were back in the good old days. A fly in the ointment, you heard that before? Ecclesiastes 10:1 says, as dead flies give perfume a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. So I think a fly in the ointment means there's something wrong with this system or something wrong with this piece of equipment. There's a fly in the ointment. I don't know, has anybody else heard that before? All right. The little bird in chapter 10, verse 20. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird of the air may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. So you've heard that. A little bird told me this or that, comes from the book of Ecclesiastes. And also it's be careful who you tell what, because it will get back around. So be careful what you put on Facebook. And then 11:1, cast your bread on the waters, for after many days you will find it again. I think that kind of talks about if you give, it shall be given to you. All right, so any questions? You may think, does Jesus appear in this book of Ecclesiastes? And I think he does. In verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 11. It says,
You hear me?
go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Did you find that walker?
Yes, we did.
Did
I
you
got
find your
one.
walker?
Got the walker.
Did you get one?
I did
Did
get
you
one.
find one?
Yes, sir.
All right.
I did.
All right.
Thank you. Verse 11 says, the words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. And I read that and I'm like, wow. The shepherd given by one shepherd. The shepherd, is Jesus. He's the good shepherd. And it talks about their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails. So almost referring to how the shepherd is going to die. So I think Jesus is here in the book of Ecclesiastes. Then Jesus in Matthew 12 actually refers back to this book and to Solomon. He said, even the queen of Sheba came to hear the words of Solomon. And Jesus said, but there's someone greater than Solomon here, referring to himself. So Jesus referred back here to Solomon and said, there's even greater wisdom in the words that I'm sharing with you than what Solomon shared. Because Jesus is really wisdom personified. He is wisdom. He is the Word. So, any final thoughts before we close? I think just the application is, if you're still chasing after something to make you happy and you haven't realized that it's God through Christ and his commandments, then that's really the application. So, all right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. We'll talk about the Song of Solomon next week, and go ahead and please read the Song of Solomon, that book, for next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Right.